I noticed with Sheikh Yasir Qadi, people used to call him a sheikh, and then now they don't want to call him a sheikh because he has opinions that are objectionable, that even I object to. I may object to some of his opinions, but I will not say he's not a sheikh just because I hate him. Like I hate that particular opinion. He is ultimately still sheikh. I'll give you an example. Who is the sheikh that, if you know me, you will know who I really hated. I hated Sheikh Ramadan al-Bouti, the grand scholar of Syria during the Hafiz and Bashar al-Assad years. Taban, he was killed in the mosque, in a masjid, he was killed. But if you know, he is one of the most knowledgeable scholars of Syria at that time. And he was a very knowledgeable scholar. He was, But despite this, when he was killed in the masjid holding the Quran, I was overjoyed. I was ecstatic. I can't remember if I did sujood al-shukr or not, but I was very, very excited and very happy and sorry. Why? Because he was not with us. So this is another distinction. Is the scholar with you or not? Regardless of his objectionable opinions, which you can viciously attack, but is the scholar in essence with you or not? Ramadan Bhuti's issue is not that he was a Sufi. Ramadan's issue was that he was with Bashar al-Assad and the tyrants and against his own people. Do you see? Let's take Hamza Yusuf, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and his sheikh, the sheikh of the sheikh, Sheikh Ibn Biyya. I consider Sheikh Hamza Yusuf as my enemy. The enemy of Muslims is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. The enemy of Palestinians, the enemy of Syrians. He is the enemy. Yeah, because he sided with the enemy. He sided with the Bush administration. He sided with the Trump. He sided with the Emiratis. He mocked the Syrian victims. He spoke. He basically provided a defeatist attitude towards the Palestinians and so on and so forth. I consider him as the enemy. But is he a sheikh? Yes. Now, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is not because he believes in istighatha and not istighatha. Even if he had the correct tawheed and aqidah and manhaj, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is because of he's not with you. He's not with you. Sheikh Rabi al-Madkhali is not with you. Imam al-Sudais, the Imam of al-Hara, is not with you. He's against you. He's your enemy. Do you understand? Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has opinions more atrocious than Sheikh Ramadan Bhouti. He has opinions more atrocious than Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. But Sheikh, if I told you his opinions, you'd be so shocked. But Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi is with you. He's with you. He's with Palestine. He's with the people of Syria. He's with the Muslims in around the world in Kashmir and so. He's with you. Do you understand? So he's one of our own that has misguided opinions that we can correct, and inshallah Allah will guide him. Yeah, but he's one of us. There's a difference. Yeah, and Sheikh Yasir Qadi. Yasir Qadi, he believes that istighatha is not kufr, it's just major sin. Okay, this is a wrong opinion. I follow the most harshest opinion on istighatha and tawassul. Yeah? I follow the harshest opinion. I only want to pray to Allah. Anything else I consider it wrong, shirk and so on. But is Sheikh Yasir Qadi one of us or not? Even worse than that, I consider what he said about the Quranic variants as extremely wrong, even though he wasn't given a chance to clarify. Sheikh Yasir Qadi, it was leaked. And by the time it was leaked and the Christian missionaries latched onto it, he was unable to correct. Khalas, it's too late. Anything he says is explosive now, it's toxic. So the blame actually is on the people who leaked this information, because he had his own private doubts or thinking. But I disagree with him on this issue. Yeah. But he's one of us. He spoke in the favor of people of Kashmir, in Palestine, he against the rulers at the time. So he's with one of us, but we can viciously attack him in his opinions that we find wrong. But he's one of us. So do you understand? We have to have a correct framework. Otherwise, we're just going to be like scattered around. Framework. Yeah. For this is just a proposal, and I'm not saying you have to follow me. So why wouldn't we consider Abu Layth, who calls himself the Mufti, the Maliki Mufti Abu Layth, a sheikh or a Mufti even? Why? It doesn't that seem contradictory to what I said? I don't consider Abu Layth a Mufti because he doesn't fit the decorum of a sheikh. Because the scholar is by urf, by the customs of the people, that he's a scholar. Abu Layth, he mocks a lot, ignoring the fact that he was arrested for possession of extreme pornography and other issues. Ignore that. Let's just say he did tawbah. But his his approach is not the approach of a scholar. He laughs a lot, mocks a lot, and of course, none of his statements are scholarly. I haven't yet found a single scholar, so I can't see how you would consider him a sheikh. If you want to, you can, but like it's not something that even if you showed a video of his clip to the layman, to anyone in the street, they would definitely not recognize him as a scholar. Like, what about Imran Hussein, the guy who rambles a lot and has the old man? Like, you can consider him a sheikh from an old man perspective, but why can't you consider him a scholar at all? There's no way I would consider him a scholar. Although if you did, I would respect your decision. Because Imran Hussein, I listened to him half an hour, 1 hour, not a lot. I'm not a big clearly, I consider him shaitan, actually. The human form of shaitan is Imran Hussein. I wouldn't be surprised if he's in contact with Dajjal himself. This is Imran Hussein. Like, Imran Hussein, the so-called sheikh, I listened to him to find one scholarly statement, forget scholarly, one statement that's not false. Taban, he may quote a Quranic verse. I'm saying from his own words. Even a hadith, most of what he quotes is da'if, or he plays around with the sanad or the matn. He's a complete fabricator of a hadith. But we're saying, okay, forget the Quran and Sunnah, his own words. Is there any statement that he has ever said from his own words? I cannot so far find. Listen to him, different excerpts and so on, cannot find. Maybe if you find even one statement, we can call him a sheikh, but I could not. And this is, by the way, impressive. I'm amazed by this. How can someone live his life and not once say a correct statement? String words together that is factually correct. Maybe he's a sheikh just for that impressive feat. But I wouldn't. Anyway, we go beyond this, inshallah. طيب, let's go into Surah Al-Isra, also called Surah Bani Israel. Surah Bani Israel. I apologize, I'm not following the voice. I'm not following the voice. We can, please save your questions to the end. I would love to answer them as I go, but I'm just, I will get too distracted. طيب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first of all, if we say to you, the Quran has a prophecy about Bani Israel, is there precedent in the Quran that there is a prophecy of any sort? Of course there is. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, غُلِبَتِ الرُّومُ فِي أَدْنَى الْأَرْضِ وَهُمْ مِنْ بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلِبُونَ. This is the prophecy that we all know. We all know this, that the Romans have been defeated, and after the defeat, they will they will go on to be victorious. This is a prophecy because this was verses that were said, were revealed, and then afterwards the Romans achieved victory, and there was even betting and a wager going on, a wager, not betting, going on between the Sahaba and between the Mushrikeen as to whether this will happen within the specified period of time or not. طيب. لقد صدق الله ورسوله الرؤيا بالحق لتدخلن المسجد الحرام إن شاء الله آمنين, and the rest of the verse. طيب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that صدق الله رسوله الرؤيا, that the vision that the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam saw was truth, that you will enter the Masjid al-Haram, inshallah aminin. You will enter al-Haram, Masjid al-Haram, even though you were oppressed in Medina and the Mushrikeen were firmly in control of Mecca, but you will enter it. This is a prophecy that happened. And of course there are many hadith about future events that will happen. لا تقوم الساعة حتى يقاتل المسلمين اليهود, and so on and so forth. The hour will not come until the Muslims fight the Jews, and so on and so forth. And the hadith about the conquest of Constantinople and so on. So the point is that it would be foolish to deny, listen to this, foolish to deny that the Quran doesn't have prophecies of the future. It's all over, it's in the Quran. It's فماشي. I hope I've convinced you that theoretically there could be a prophecy. Theoretically there could be a prophecy. طيب. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, let's take the first verse. سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى الذي باركنا حوله لنريه من آياتنا إنه هو السميع البصير. This is a famous verse of that we all know. It's one of the most famous verses in the Quran. Everyone knows this because it relates to the wonderful miracle of the Isra and Mi'raj journey. But this verse, let's reevaluate this verse from a geopolitical standpoint. Yeah, the Muslims. This was 1 year before Hijrah. Mecca, Masjid al-Haram was filled with idols. The Muslims were severely persecuted such that they needed to flee, and such that they needed to flee. Wait, can you guys hear me? Oh, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, such that they needed to flee. And now al-Masjid al-Haram here is not described as being blessed, but that doesn't mean it's not blessed. Don't let anyone tell you it's not blessed. There's another verse, الذي ببكة مباركة. There's another hadith that says that Mecca is also called Becca, that it's Mubarak, that it's blessed, Mubarak. So it's implied that it's Mubarak. But the question is, the Quran is introducing Masjid al-Aqsa now. So the focus of the surah and the focus of the entire is on Bani Israel and Masjid al-Aqsa. So it's mentioning now Masjid al-Aqsa. So the Quran, despite the Muslims being persecuted and definitely not in control at that time, this was 1 year before Hijrah, of the Masjid al-Haram, the Quran is stating its political claim over Bilad al-Haramain, of Masjid al-Haram. It's that it belongs to the Muslims. It doesn't belong to the Mushrikeen. That we are the inheritors of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salam. Yeah. من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى. Here, from the Masjid al-Haram, he's traveled to Masjid al-Aqsa. Now, the word Masjid al-Aqsa, I told you, could mean, has a linguistic meaning of the furthest mosque. Now, some scholars limited their understanding to that to mean just the furthest in geographical distance at that time. So they said, oh, Masjid al-Nabawi is closer to, like if you did a triangle, Masjid al-Nabawi is closer to Masjid al-Haram, and therefore Masjid al-Aqsa is the furthest away. Now, this may be linguistically correct and so on and so forth, but just like Masjid al-Haram has a symbolic meaning, Masjid al-Aqsa also has a symbolic meaning, that it's the furthest reaches and ambitions of the Ummah. Why is it the furthest reaches of the Ummah? Look, Islam started in Mecca. But where will it end? Well, we know it will end in Bilad al-Sham. But specifically Masjid al-Aqsa, because there is a hadith, we can talk about it later, where the Khilafah will travel. It traveled from Bilad al-Haramain. It traveled to Baghdad, to Dimashq. It traveled to Istanbul. It traveled, and then it will end in Masjid al-Aqsa. So, and we know about the events of Dajjal and Isa ibn Maryam and Ya'juj and Ma'juj. They all will come to the blessed land of Masjid al-Aqsa. So Islam starts in Mecca, but it ends in Masjid al-Aqsa. It's a symbolic journey. It's a real journey, but I mean there's a symbolism behind the traveling of Rasulullah from Masjid al-Haram to Masjid al-Aqsa that has political ramifications. We Muslims stake our claim over Masjid al-Haram, and we stake our claim over Masjid al-Aqsa. طيب, when this happened, there was not a single Jewish person, or very unlikely to be even a single Jewish person in Jerusalem, possibly in most of Palestine. They were persecuted by the Christians, and the Romans had occupied that, and the Christians were living in that. They controlled it. So you would think that the next verses would be about Isa ibn Maryam, about the cross, Trinity. No. The next verse is about Musa, and then we go into the promise to Bani Israel. Why? The Christians think their God was raised and was crucified in Jerusalem, but for them it's not the political capital. The political capital is for Bani Israel. They think they were given that land. They were promised that land. So this verse came as to set the record straight. Do you see? Even though during the time when it was revealed, not a single Jewish person or hardly any Jewish people were living there. They came later. They were gathered later. Yeah. So that's the first thing that we have to pay attention to. Yeah. I want to, before we go into the verses, understand some history. There is some history that needs to be understood. First one is that when Sulaiman alayhi salam, he died in 930, yani the best estimate is 935 BC. He died in 935 BC. When he died, he obviously had a strong kingdom, and yani, we don't need to go into Sayyidina Sulaiman's life. But the Bani Israel inherited the united kingdom of Israel. So they had a very powerful nation. They inherited it from Sayyidina Sulaiman alayhi salam. And as, by the way, as a side tangent, Bani Israel, they hate Sayyidina Sulaiman. They say very bad stuff about him. Why? Can you see? Whereas they love Sayyidina Musa and even Dawood alayhi salam. They love them. But Sayyidina Sulaiman, there's specific hatred and animosity to him. Come on, they say they like him, but if you look at their statement, they make him sound like an immoral person and so on. Because Sayyidina Sulaiman, he opened up his kingdom in a like ethnic way. As in, I don't want to mean like the others did that, but he had a kingdom that was so vast, and he included he had, first of all, jinn and humans. So he was open to different species across the animal kingdom, but he also had non-Jewish, yani non-people from Bani Israel and people from Bani Israel. He had a vast kingdom. So they felt that that was an act of betrayal, that they weren't his inner circle. He had people, he was like an equal opportunities person. So I think that's why they made up a lot of lies about him. But in any case, Sulaiman alayhi salam had a son called Rahubam. I don't know if I can say it correctly, Rabuham or Rahubam, something like that. He was supposed to be the Khalifa of Sulaiman alayhi salam, the next person to take over. So he was going to be, he's now the de facto leader of the United Kingdom of Israel. The 10 out of the 12 tribes, initially 11, but then eventually became 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel, said no way. They did khuruj. They rebelled against the leader. And they set up the kingdom of Israel. The kingdom of Israel in the north. They set up the kingdom of Israel. So do you see, from 935 BC, they say, no, we're not going to follow the son of Sulaiman, Ibn Sulaiman, and they went and they did their own kingdom. This is not in Quds. They were not, their capital was not in Jerusalem. They had, that's why they say the West Bank is, we want to take it back, because this was where they were. So they said, no, we want to go back. They said, we will not follow you. Khalas. They rebelled, basically, and they went along their own way. Rehoboam became the leader of another faction where only the tribes of Judah and later on Benjamin, they followed him, and his capital was Al-Quds, and he called it the Kingdom of Judah. So now the United Kingdom of Israel, most of the Israelites, they do khuruj, they start the fasad. This is where the fasad starts, the corruption starts. They go on and they become they set up their own kingdom, and what is left is the kingdom of Judah. Now, Rehoboam, I think he was a righteous person, but eventually even the kings of the kingdom of Judah become corrupt as well. And their corruption takes different forms. They, within themselves, both the kingdom of Israel, which was more corrupt than the kingdom of Judah, they become very corrupt, very immoral, vices spread, and so on and so forth. But also they attack their neighboring non-Israelite tribes, and so on and so on. They become very aggressive. So, and they obviously deviate away from the ruling of the Torah, and so on and so forth. They don't rule by the Sharia of the Torah. They kill innocent people. They do immoral actions and so on. So they commit grave fasad. They become like mass fasad. This is something that's recapitulated in the Bible. This is something I'm not making it up. This is in the Bible, and their fasad is mentioned in the Bible, and so on. Now, what happens in 722 BC? The Assyrians and others. Taban, there was also the pharaoh as well, but he was weak. He was like a proxy. He was weak at that time. But in any case, the Assyrians, and by the way, the Assyrians and Babylonians, who are they? They are descended from Arabs. And in any case, they controlled the area that we now call the Arab world. They had dominance over Arabia, they had dominance over parts of Arabia, they had dominance over Iraq, Bilad al-Sham, and they had influence over Egypt. Their area is what we would call the Middle East or the Arab world. That was their area of influence. So they came and they destroyed, killed and vanquished the 10 tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is 722. And this came after 19 kings were destroyed. 19 kings of the kingdom of Israel, and then this happens. 136 years later, The kingdom of Judah is then destroyed after 19 kings as well, even though there's a big age difference, but some of the kings lived longer and he was on 19. This was destroyed by a different army. Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army took them, and in the Bible, this is called the Babylonian captivity. He put them in the trucks and let's go to, he took them, and this is called the Babylonian captivity. And he destroyed the first temple that Sulaiman alayhi salam built. So this was the end of the first fasad. This was the corruption that ended. Yeah, do you see? So, but my point here is that the Jewish people since that time have dreamt of returning back to this land and setting up something like the United Kingdom of Israel. It's been their dream to go back to the glory days and set up this United Kingdom of Israel type. There were periods of history, listen to this. There were periods of history where they had limited, superficial self-rule under the Romans and the Greek people, like the Greeks and Roman Empire, especially the Romans. But this is, even by their own words, this is not real. This was just like a superficial, they were like a client state. They weren't even like properly in control. They were like, they were really weak and they were just not in control. And the Romans just could do whatever they want. When they didn't like them, they would just come and crush them and so on. This is not what they were dreaming of. This is not their power and might that they're dreaming of, like that was present in the United Kingdom of Israel. They weren't this powerful nations. Here, they were just weak. So they themselves don't consider this. They consider the second time was Israel, not the Roman random weak states, but during Israel. So there were two times throughout their history that they reached, that had the state of a country, sovereignty, power, was the United Kingdom of Israel, and then that split into fasad after Sulaiman alayhi salam died. And the second one was in 1948 when they set up the State of Israel. But we need to go into more detail about that. But I hope I gave you some of the history. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says after Subhanalladhi asra, to the end of the verse, بِعَبْدِهِ لَيْلًا مِنَ الْمَسْجِدِ الْحَرَامِ إِلَى الْمَسْجِدِ الْأَقْصَى, he says, وَأَتَيْنَا مُوسَى الْكِتَابَ وَجَعَلْنَاهُ هُدًى لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. So he said, we gave Musa the book, alayhi salam. We gave Sayyidina Musa al-Kitab. We gave him the book, and we made him, the book here is the Torah. According to most of the Mufassirun. We gave him the book, وَجَعَلْنَاهُ هُدًى لِبَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. And we made him a guidance, a source of guidance to the people of Bani Israel. أَلَّا تَتَّخِذُوا مِن دُونِي وَكِيلًا. I think it's wakila, yeah. Do not take beside me alliances or allies. In Bani Israel, their problem throughout history is that they have sided with the oppressors throughout most of history. They always wonder, and I'm not here to victim blame them, but they always wonder, why do they always get attacked? Most of the time they tend to side with their enemy, then when, like with the oppressors, and then when the oppressors get overthrown, people blame them and then attack. I'm not trying to justify. There are times it's wrong to attack innocent people, but I'm saying that often they're perceived as correctly or incorrectly as siding with the oppressors. Of course, we as Muslims have to be more just and so on. But I'm just saying that there are times when they are this. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding them. Again, He doesn't mention Isa. The issue is not with Christians. Our issue, ultimately, even though the Crusaders came to the land, but that wasn't the final issue. Our final battle is with Bani Israel. So Musa alayhi salam is reminding them that they have to rely only on Allah. Don't let the British carry you to the Holy Land and kick the Palestinians out. Do not let the Americans fund you. Do not let the Soviet Union recognize you. Do not rely on Allah only. Do not be one of those people who take alliances and seek the assistance of the people besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding them of what was told to Musa alayhi salam. But what do? They do the opposite. They always rely on the powerful. And now they're heading towards India and China. They're heading east. Yeah. We will talk about that after the promise. What is there? Why do they get mentioned again during the time of the Dajjal and so on and so forth? Is there a link there? Like, ذرية من حملنا مع نوح إنه كان عبدا شكورا. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, ذرية من حملنا مع نوح, and the offspring of Nuh, the offspring of Nuh. He reminds them of Nuh alayhi salam, ذرية من حملنا مع نوح, in the ark, يعني, the offspring of Nuh. إنه كان عبدا شكورا. Nuh was our slave, a slave of ours that was, listen to this, that was thankful. شكورا. إنه كان عبدا شكورا. You may wonder why Nuh alayhi salam was mentioned here. Musa, we understand. What's Nuh alayhi salam got to do with this? And by the way, I thought of this a long time as well. I'm like, why is Nuh alayhi salam mentioned? Because many of the people who discuss this prophecy do not mention this. This is a perplexing thing for them. Why is Nuh alayhi salam not mentioned? I did not know the answer until I heard once a talk, a lesson, a talk, yani, from a rabbi. The rabbi, he's the ex-rabbi of Indonesia, Tovia Singer. He said that the Noahites, that Nuh alayhi salam had laws, commandments, similar but much more simpler than the commandments in the Torah and the Tanakh. He said these were Noahite laws for all of humanity. Yani, according to Jewish theology, it's not just Bani Israel that has to follow Tawheed, and they can't do shirk. No, and eat the halal meat and kosher and so on. No, all of humanity has to follow it. But instead of following the Torah, the rest of humanity has to follow other commandments called the Noahites. And he said, according to him, Muslims are the only Noahites today, or at least they are clearly Noahites today. Christians, no. They do shirk, Trinity, and so on. But Muslims, they are Noahites. That could be one reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding them of the Nuh alayhi salam, that ultimately they should get down from their high horse. I mean, the idea of their racial supremacy, that that the Palestinians that they're going to oppress in the future, they also follow the Noahide laws. They are also from the offspring of Nuh alayhi salam, and they are muwahhidin, they're not mushrikeen, they're not Gentiles that we should persecute and destroy, and you understand. So they are righteous people, but there could be other reasons reminding them that the favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not just, it's not just about khalas, we have an unbroken chain with Bani Israel and no other person in humanity Allah can have a promise with. La, if they break their promise, that promise is given to someone else. That could be a reason why it's meant. Right. Now we go into the next part, the actual prophecy. And I want to okay, let me say the prophecy, then I will comment on the difference between the previous scholars of tafsir and the modern scholars of then Sheikh Yasir Qadi, he gave the summary. I forgot to mention, I went on a big tangent, but he gave a summary that was very nicely done. Of course, he went over a lot of the differences. He just gave a very concise summary and people thought that he came up with this. No. There's many scholars, modern scholars of tafsir, that had come up with this. In fact, he didn't come up with anything. Nothing he said is him. He just took it from the modern scholars of tafsir. However, many people in the comment section were very confused. Who conquered who? What was this fasad, second fasad? People were very confused. And then people also had other misconceptions about the Mahdi, about the tribes, the ethnic tribe. They had so many problems. So we want to address some of these issues as well. طيب. وقضينا إلى بني إسرائيل في الكتاب. وقضينا إلى بني إسرائيل. Israel is Yaqub alayhi salam. We all know this. There's no difference of opinion on this. Yeah. وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيل. And Bani Israel are the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel. Yani, it's the ethnicity aspect of it. Yeah. The 12 tribes. Yeah. When Bani Israel set up the state of Israel, they were acting more ethnically based on their ethnicity, not based on their religion. Many of them didn't even believe in God. But do you see? That's another indication. Yeah, the Quran is very precise. وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي Bani Israel. So here, Bani Israel, we will address the issue of why Bani Israel, people say, but wait a minute. But the Jews today are not from Bani Israel. Some of them are Russian, some of them are Americans. We will come into this issue. And this is another big misconception. They say the Jews that came from 1948, They are not the Bani Israel that's mentioned in the Quran. And that's a false statement, but we will come and address that in detail later. So what the word qada wa qadayna means declare, prophesize, told, foretold, decreed. They all mean different things, but in this context, it means prophecy. Yeah, because it's something. Because if you read the rest of the 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 verse and the verses, it's clear a prophecy. Even the old scholars of tafsir said this. وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي الْكِتَابِ. We told him in Bani Israel in the book, and the book here is overwhelmingly, most of the scholars have said, past and present, said it's the Torah, it's the previous scripture. Um, وقضينا في واتينا sorry وقضينا الى بني اسرائيل في الكتاب لتفسدن في الارض مرتين. You will cause corruption on earth twice. You will cause corruption on earth twice. وَلَتَعْلُنَّ عُلُوًّا كَبِيرًا. And you will rise a mighty rise. يعني you're going to become a really powerful country, yeah, a really powerful people. فإذا جاء وعد أولاهما. And then when the first promise came, إذا جاء وعد أولاهما بعثنا عليكم عبادة. Okay, but wait, before we go there, let's first focus on what has been said. لتفسدن في الأرض مرتين ولتعلن علوا كبيرا. You will cause fasad twice on the earth. Fasad. What does fasad mean? Fasad means corruption, meaning when for example, when milk goes off, that's considered like the milk has gone corrupt. That's like linguistically. But in reality, things like killing people unlawfully, when you do things that are deviated from what is right and normal, what is right and correct. So fasad is committing, for example, zina. That's a form of fasad. Fasad is, especially at the societal level, it's considered fasad. There's fahisha, obviously, but fasad is when you for example, kill people unlawfully. You said you commit you steal people's land. That's all form of fasad. You don't rule by Islam. That's also or by, in their case, the Sharia of the Torah. It's also a form of fasad, and so on and so forth. So fasad is when things are corrupt, and it can take many forms, of course. But in this case, the Quran kept it, said "La tufsidunna fil ard." Throughout the land, you will cause fasad twice. The word twice here puzzle, like a lot of people got confused. They said, what do we mean by twice? The Bani Israel, individually, as groups, they formed fasad multiple times. At least during Prophet Muhammad's time, they formed it at least 3 times. During the Roman era, more fasad. During the time of Isa ibn Maryam, more fasad. During the time of fasad, literally their whole history is fasad. So the question is, why does the Quran say twice? The Quran here is saying twice. The fasad here is the fasad of the political level, at the state level. In other words, they will only have 2 political entities that are, sovereign and so on. The 2 political entities throughout their history that will be in a state of corruption. No third. There will be no third Israel. There was the kingdom of Israel, the state of Israel, nothing, no third Israel. Yeah. So the fasad here is the fasad of the state level, not the fasad of individual groups. Yeah. Otherwise, we Muslims have fasad amongst ourselves. Yeah, the issue here is the fasad of the state level. And you will rise a mighty rise. Now, here the word wala ta'lunna, you will rise a mighty rise, or you will become transgressive in a mighty way. Is this referring to both corruptions or only the second corruption? Yani that's another contention. Because the Quran says, لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْن. You will cause corruption twice, and you will rise a mighty rise. Is this waw, وَلَا تَعْلُنَّ, this waw, which, by the way, لَتُفْسِدُنَّ and وَلَا تَعْلُنَّ is in the future tense. That's why it's definitely a prophecy. Yeah, لَتُفْسِدُنَّ, because this was said during the time of Musa alayhi salam. So this is talking about things that will happen in the future. لَتُفْسِدُنَّ فِي الْأَرْضِ مَرَّتَيْن وَلَا تَعْلُنَّ. Is this waw relating to the first fasad or second fasad? It's definitely relating to the second fasad that started in 1948. But is it relating to the first fasad? We don't know. There's difference of opinion. Depends on how you want to look at it. But definitely the second fasad. So, and some say this is evidence that the second state of Israel is more powerful than, and there's more fasad than the first state of Israel. Do you see that the current 1948, they rose a mightier rise? They had nuclear weapons. They had America, superpowers. They had they reached they were able to literally own and pawn and crush all their neighboring enemy, and they do airstrikes around the region as they want. They've reached a state of a transgression that wasn't even reached back then. Back in the back when there was the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. So they reached a level of even greater fasad. Yeah. This statement, فساد في الأرض, لتفسدن في الأرض, and then العلو, this mirrors, is like minus 180 degree what we see in Surah Al-Qasas about, there's a habit of them becoming victims and then becoming abusers. Abuse, victim, abuse. They have this habit, yeah? Okay, why? In Surah Al-Qasas, listen to this. فرعون is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about فرعون, إن فرعون علا في الأرض. فرعون reach ulu. He rose upon the earth. علا في الأرض, yeah? He became mighty on the earth. علا في الأرض. وجعل أهلها شيعا, and so on and so on. That he killed the people. I'm not going to go into it because we've discussed Surah Al-Qasas many times. But that same verse ends with, look at this. إنه كان من المفسدين. He was from the mufsidin. So Fir'aun is the opposite here. It says he reached ulu first, then he did fasad. Bani Israel did fasad, then they described as reaching ulu. So in other words, Fir'aun, he took power. Power corrupted him. He took power, he became mighty, he became the supreme leader, the dear leader, and then he started his campaign of pogroms and persecution of the Bani Israel. Whereas Bani Israel, they became corrupt first, and their corruption led them to be powerful on the land. Do you see? It's as if the way they reach power is itself corrupt. And we know that's what happened, right? First of all, they were funded by wealthy people who benefited from the riba transactions, from interest. Then they also took over, they also solicited the aid of the British and to...
Assalamu alaikum. His internet has cut out. So you know we can't hear you, Akhi. I think Mossad got him, probably. Allahu A'lam. I think I'm going to disconnect him, and he can reconnect, just so he knows that he's not giving the lecture right now.
You guys hear me?
Now we can, alhamdulillah.
I think I dropped there, sorry. I don't know what was the last thing I said now, but okay. So I think you got to the bit where there was two fasad, right? Fir'aun is the opposite of all the way back there. طيب. Riba to get wealthy. طيب. So here there are two fasads, then arise. Yeah. لتعلن علوا كبيرا. طيب. Here, listen. I told you that their facade of they did gangs like the Ben Gurion and the Haganah gangs. They took over. We discussed, and then They only became powerful in 1967 after the war. Before that, they were still establishing and becoming more powerful, more powerful, more powerful, more powerful. Yeah, even after they set up their state, they weren't very strong. It was only later. In other words, they became corrupt, and it's through their corruption that they became powerful, in opposite to Fir'aun. But before we go into the two promises, the two fasad, I would like to point out that the previous scholars, Ibn Kathir, Imam al-Tabari, al-Qurtubi, all of the previous scholars, none of them said that all of them said that the two promises has already happened, even though the second promise is in the future tense. All of them said it was in the past tense. Why? Why did they say this? We told you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَضَيْنَا إِلَى بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ فِي الْكِتَابِ, in the book, which is the Torah. So what did they say? They said, let's go back to the Torah and let's look at all the times that the enemies of Bani Israel destroyed them. So they said, oh, they were destroyed by the Nebuchadnezzar, they were destroyed by the Romans, and so they said, oh, these are the two fasads. Of course, even within the early scholars of tafsir, the past scholars of tafsir, they did not agree. If you read the books of tafsir, you won't find two books that agree. They all disagreed as to what the two fasads are. Is it the fasad during the time of Yahya? When is it the fasad of Nebuchadnezzar? Is it the fasad of the Assyrians? Is it the fasad of during the Greeks, the Romans? They all disagreed because but they all assumed incorrectly that the two fasads have happened. Even though when we look at the linguistic, we'll do it later, the second fasad is clearly in the future tense. Why did they do that? Because when they were writing the books of tafsir, it never even crossed their mind. It was the last thing you could possibly imagine that Bani Israel will, in the heart of the Islamic world, muster enough power, even though they're scattered and severely oppressed. They were very severely oppressed throughout the land, everywhere. Basically, they were everywhere. In the Muslims, they were treated the best, but still they were weak, and they were not. How can they gather and how can they overcome Muslims? They overcome all these massive Muslims. It never occurred to them during the Abbasid, the Umayyin, the Uthmaniyin, and so it just never occurred to them. The Crusaders, yes. If you told them Christians will come in the land, yes, they will accept that. Chinese, yes. India, yes, but not Bani Israel. It never crossed their mind. So that's the first. The other thing is, a prophecy is validated. It's like me saying the Rohingya will one day become a superpower. I can't even say it with a straight face, right? It doesn't even compute, right? The Uyghurs will one day overcome China. We cannot even compute it, yeah? So, do you see? Sabr, let me answer the questions later. Sorry. Let me answer the questions later, yeah? Because otherwise I will get distracted. So I apologize about that. طيب. فهي, and by the way, if you think that the Quran is only encapsulated in by Ibn Kathir and Tabari and so on, you're wrong. These books of tafsir are the starting point of understanding the Quran. The Quran is an ocean. It cannot, greater than the oceans, cannot be contained in all of this. If you think that you can just read one book of tafsir, khas, you finish. The other thing is that earlier scholars of tafsir relied heavily on Israeliyat. For example, if I ask you, how did John the Baptist get killed? All of you will say the prostitute wanted him to be killed, his head was killed and presented to the you all have the story, right? Which came from the Israeliyat. There's no evidence, authentic evidence, that this is a correct story. We're assuming just because the Jewish people chatted crap half the time. We don't know if it's true or not, yet we all act like it's khalas aqidah. John the Baptist definitely was beheaded and killed. Do you see? But it's all 100% of the story is based on Israeliyat. So here the scholars of the past disagreed, and the prophecy validated the modern scholars of tafsir, because they were able to establish the state of Israel, the modern state in 1948. That invalidated all the earlier scholars of tafsir who didn't understand the context because they never imagined that they would have established it. The prophecy is the one who validated this idea. The time and history is what validates the prophecy ultimately. Yeah? طيب. وقضينا إلى بني إسرائيل في الكتاب لتفسدن في الأرض مرتين ولتعلن علوا كبيرة. Let's go into the first fasad. فإذا جاء وعد أولاهما when the first promise came, and what is the first promise? The first promise is mentioned in another verse in the Quran. يا قوم ادخلوا الأرض المقدسة التي كتب الله لكم. Oh, يا قوم, referring to the people of Israel, enter the land the Holy Land that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised you. كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ. He has promised you. So they were able to return after, eventually, yani, they took their sweet time because of various transgressions, but afterward they were able to return to the Holy Land, and then they inherited the Sulaiman, you know the whole story, and then they inherited the United Kingdom, and then that fell. So that first fasad, their promise and the corruption is mentioned in the Bible, and it's something no person would disagree on. Read the Bible, or maybe don't read it, but just read, but if you want to read it, you can see there, it's there. It's throughout the Bible, what happened to them, that started in the promise and ended in the Babylonian captivity. Right. But there's a problem here. Some people said, بَعَثْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ عِبَادًا لَنَا, that we sent to you servants of us, like عِبَادًا لَنَا, our servants, who are harsh in might, فَجَاسُوا, they crept throughout the land, وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. طبعا, the opinion, the most scholars of the past and present, even though there were differences of opinion, went with that this is Nebuchadnezzar. Why? Because فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدَّارِ mean they went and they took you one by one. And that's what happened. They took them one by one into captivity. So, and they were harsh. Nebuchadnezzar and his army were very harsh, mighty people. فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ, and that's what happened. جَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ, they went throughout the land. وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. But there are some modern scholars, and most prominently the Egyptian Sheikh of Tafsir, Sheikh al-Sha'rawi, Allah yarhamu, who captivated people. He actually was one of the earliest scholars who mentioned this prophecy to the masses, live on TV, millions of people watch. It was like very captivating. But he has a different opinion, which I think is wrong. But his opinion is ibadan lana. He introduced this doubt in the people's mind that ibadan lana is only to Muslims. He said, because Allah is referring ibadan lana, our slaves, that's like a personal thing. Like Allah is attributing the slaves to him. So he said, this is for Muslims. طبعا, the word ibadan lana is only mentioned here. This phrase ibadan lana is only mentioned here in this point in the Quran. So it's hard to make an analogy with other verses that don't mention this. But then he said, well, other verses which mention the kuffar just mention slaves, abid, and so on, but ibadan lana is not mentioned there. But in response to Sheikh al-Sha'rawi, he said ibadan lana, what did Sheikh al-Sha'rawi say? Ibadan lana as in these were our slaves, meaning the Muslims, meaning the first promise is not even predating Islam. He went beyond the other people. He said the first promise is not even before Islam. It was during the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the Bani Israel did fasad in Medina and so on, and they were kicked out, and you know what happened to them in Bani Qaynuqa, Bani Nadir, and Bani Qurayza. They were either expelled or killed. But he said this is the fasad. And Uli Ba'sin Shadid refers to, in Surah Al-Fath, Muhammad wa man ma'ahu ashiddaء al-kuffar ruhamaa bainahum, that Muhammad and his Sahaba are those with him are harsh on the believers and they're merciful to one another. So he said ibadan lana ashiddaء, that's referring to this characteristic of the Sahaba. طبعا, the context of these verses are relating to Bayt al-Maqdis, to the mosque, masjid, as we will see later in the verse. So it wouldn't make sense to be talking about Medina. Secondly, only a fraction of Jews were in Medina. Thirdly, Sheikh al-Sha'rawi, he's a great scholar. I really love that guy. But I'm saying that I think he was wrong here for various reasons. Ibadan lana, he is assuming that Ibadan lana only applies to the believers. But there's a hadith in Sahih Muslim that completely refutes what he says without a shadow of doubt, relating to Ya'juj and Ma'juj. The army of Ya'juj and Ma'juj, which I think will come from the far Asian country, the army of Ya'juj and Ma'juj which is going to fight Isa alayhi salam. They are kuffar. There's no doubt about that. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in Sahih Muslim, in the book of Fitan, in the mention of the chapter mentioning Dajjal, in Ya'juj and Ma'juj, he says, فَبَيْنَمَا هُوَ كَذَلِكَ إِذْ أَوْحَى اللَّهُ إِلَىٰ عِيسَى ibn Maryam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave wahi to Isa ibn Maryam. This is the words of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. أَنِّي قَدْ أَخْرَجْتُ عِبَادًا لِي, that I have set forth عِبَادًا لِي, servants of mine. Like, do you see? So here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is attributing Ya'juj and Ma'juj to himself. عِبَادًا لِي لا يدان لأحد بقتالهم. No one can fight them. So here, even though they're kuffar, they're fighting Isa ibn Maryam alayhi salam and the army and so on, but the Muslims and so on, but he's saying ibadan li. So this is a direct refutation of Sheikh Sharawi. The other one is that there are even other verses in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, referring to the kuffar, mentions ibadihi, ibadi, ibadika, ibadana, mentions things in the, maybe not ibadan lana, but something very close to that. For example, Inna Allah bi'ibadihi lakhabirun basir. That Allah with his servants, with his slaves or servants, is very all-seeing, all-knowing. Antum adlaltum ibadi هؤلاء أم هم ضلوا السبيل. Did you misguide my servants, these servants of mine, or did they just misguide themselves in the path? Do you see what I mean? Like, as in the other verses that mention the kuffar as ibadan lana, as not ibadan lana, but attributing back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then there is also an athar by Umar ibn al-Khattab, narrated in Ibn Sa'd في الطبقات. يعني we don't know if it's authentic or not, like it's not like being extensively studied, but Umar ibn al-Khattab says in relation to, he mentions the first promise. Look at this. Umar al-Khattab says, وَلَا تَقُولُوا إِنَّ عَدُوَّنَا شَرٌّ مِنَّا فَلَنْ يُسَلِّطَ عَلَيْنَا وَإِنْ أَسَأْنَا فرب يوم سلط عليهم شر منهم كما سلط على بني إسرائيل. Umar al-Khattab says, don't say that our enemy is more evil than us, and therefore we're not going to be defeated by them. Yani Allah's not going to send him to us. And a lot of people say this, oh, if we're so Muslims, and Allah will never let us be defeated. We can be defeated if we violate his promises. فَلَنْ يُسَلِّطَ عَلَيْنَا وَإِنْ أَسَأْنَا. Even if we're bad, we're still believers. We still have tawheed, خلاص. Yeah, even if we, yeah. فَرُبَّ قَوْمٍ سُلِّطَ عَلَيْهِمْ شَرٌّ مِّنْهُم. He said, there are people, how many times are people Allah sent someone who's more evil than. عشان كده we have to be careful when we say I'm against America, therefore I will support China. لا, sometimes the anti-resistant is more cursed than the resistance himself. Yeah, but Bashar is more cursed than the Zionist himself. Yeah, فرب قوم سلط عليهم شر منهم كما سلط على. Umar al-Khattab is referring back to the history now. He said كما سلط على, and Umar al-Khattab, out of all the Sahaba, was the most read, other than literally the Sahaba who were from Bani Israel, was the most read in terms of the Bible, by the way. He used to read it extensively until, yeah. كما سلط على بني إسرائيل لما أتوا مساخط الله كفرة الوسي فجاسوا خلال الديار وكان وعدا مفعولا. Here Umar al-Khattab does something remarkable. If this sanad is correct, he said, he remembers the Bani Israel, how they were met with the kafara. He calls the ibadan lana kafara. He calls them kafara. He calls them disbelievers. فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ. So he's clearly talking about the first promise. فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ. He's referring to the army of Nebuchadnezzar as kafara. وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. And he says it's a promise, because the verse says وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. It's a promise fulfilled. So here, Umar ibn Khattab, if this sanad is correct, is effectively saying the first promise is predating Islam. It's already fulfilled. And that's why it's in the past tense. And it came it was revealed during 1 year before Hijrah. Surah Isra was revealed 1 year before Hijrah. And so it makes sense. It was a promise before Islam, nothing to do with. So this is another refutation of Sheikh Sharawi and the other scholars who said that it's now. That it was during the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It doesn't even make sense. It's in the past tense. And it was a promise fulfilled. How can a promise fulfilled be relating to Bani Qaynuqa and Bani Nadir when it was 1 year before Hijrah? It doesn't even make sense linguistically and so on. And but they were confused by the word ibadan lana. Now notice Umar ibn Khattab. Yes, it's Makki. Yes, Surah Al-Isra is Makki 1 year before Hijrah. That's like the majority of scholars have agreed that especially these verses were 1 year before Hijrah. Like وكان وعدا مفعولا. So he said this was before Islam. Here, look, Umar ibn Khattab doesn't mention the second promise. Let's assume the second promise came before Islam, like what the past scholars of Mufassirun said. They said that both promises came, even though the second promise is in the future tense. Then why didn't Umar ibn al-Khattab mention the second promise? Why doesn't he say the second promise is when they were destroyed twice because of their two fasads? It seems like Umar al-Khattab understood that the first fasad had already happened, The second fasad still hasn't happened. If the second fasad is relating, then some scholars said, well, the first fasad was Nebuchadnezzar, the second fasad was the Prophet during the Prophet Muhammad's time with the interaction with Quraysh. So why didn't he say, and the second fasad is happened when we destroyed them in Bani Qaynuqa? Yani that's more likely to be mentioned. No, he only mentions the first fasad because the second fasad hasn't happened. That if this author, so if this author is correct, then it would be a smoking gun. But we would have to check if this author, if this statement is correct. طيب. عبادا لنا أولي بأس شديد. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar is very harsh with his army. That's no question about that. يعني all the history books have agreed on that. فجاسوا خلال الديار. Now, one scholar, I think his name was, he's a Jordanian scholar. I forgot his name now. Sheikh al-Ashqar. He's a noble scholar of hadith, and he passed away. Allah yarhamu. He said, no, none of the two promises have happened yet. And he said, that this, عبادا لنا أولي بأس شديد فجاسوا خلال الديار. He said, the Babylonians didn't do that. They didn't stealthily go around the land. He said, this is going to happen in a future war with Muslims, where first the Muslims will, he thinks it's a future battle with Muslims, that none of these two promises. Again, it doesn't fit with the idea that the first promise was in the past tense. So again, but he just, he again, fajasu is a very strange word to use. Fajasu. They crept. Usually the army comes triumphant, strong. Fajasu means they crept. They went in, when like water creeps through. Fajasu, they were stealthy. So, طبعا there was other scholars who said that Fajasu khilal diyar refers to the first intifada, or the intifadas عموما, the first and second intifada, because the Palestinians would go creep stealthily. They would do like missions, and they would like destroy the Israelis and so on and so forth. So they said Fajasu khilal al-diyar refers to that. But again, all of them are missing the fact that this verse is in the past tense. خلاص, finished. Fajasu. وَكَانَ وَعْدًا مَفْعُولًا. And it is a promise that's already fulfilled, predating Islam, predating Surah Isra. So they seem to ignore that bit, but that's a very important thing, I think, to mention. طيب. We continue because we want to make use of time. ثم رددنا لكم القرة عليهم. Then we returned the ball back into your favor. Yani we reversed the matter. Yeah. وأمددناكم. And then we assisted you with wealth. بأموال. That's the first. Look at the order. The order also matters. وأمددناكم بأموال. Yeah. وأمددناكم بأموال وبنين, and sons. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أَكْثَرَ نَفِيرًا. And we made you more eager for war, more equipped for war. Nafir al-am, like when you fight, grand mobilization. We made you more eager. The Israeli defense forces fly. The others are scared to fight. They're very muscular. Yeah. وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أَكْثَرَ نَفِيرًا. طيب. You have to understand something. When we look at conflict and enemies, Bani Israel look at things differently from us. We just look at religion, Islam. We don't look at ethnicity. We don't care if a Palestinian, Pakistani, at least I hope we don't. Yeah. But Bani Israel, they take religion into consideration, but they also take ethnicity into consideration. Meaning they see us, as, especially in the Arab world, they see us as the descendants of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and they see us as them. They see, you see. So in their perspective, the war is still there. They see the Palestinians as the descendants of the Canaanites, and just like they were ordered to, they had license to destroy the Canaanites or fight them. They think they still have the same license. Do you see how they see things? And we saw this in the Iraq War. They were pressuring George Bush, and many of the like neocons were Israeli or like Jewish. I mean, they had this aqidah, even the Christian Zionists, they had this aqidah that the Iraqis, modern day Iraqis, are the extension or the descendants of Babylonians in the Bible. So for them, it's not just khalas, he's Muslim and before they were pagans. La, it's still the same continuation for them. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling him, this region, the enemies that you had, the Edomites and the Moabites, and these people are now the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Their descendants are what we call the Arab world or the Middle East. Yeah, that part of the world, not just strictly Arab. It could be Kurds, it could be Turkmen. But the point is, they are the people that live in the region that we call the inner Middle East or the Arab world. But the word thumma then implies a sequence, but after a long time. It's described in the creation. of man and so on and so forth. The Quran describes it. Thumma is often used in the Quran to mean a very long time. So even though this was something predating Islam, they never forgot. They still believed that they had to return back to this land, that they're still bitter about their enemies who took them out. So what has happened is they now had the upper hand. They mobilized the Rothschilds and so on and so forth. I have to be careful what I say. They gained lots of wealth. They through riba and through other means, they gained lots of wealth. They started وَأَمْدَدْنَاكُمْ, Allah assisted you, وَأَمْدَدْنَاكُمْ بِأَمْوَالٍ, with wealth. It doesn't mean it was just their wealth. They were assisted with wealth from their own self, and even we Arabs gave them wealth. Yeah, we Arab gave them wealth. The Europeans gave them wealth. So they were given so much wealth, especially after 1948, right? They were given, wealth was poured in. Lots of their constructions. In fact, there are Christians who pay any Jewish person who wants to migrate back. They will pay their flight, their hotel fees, their food, and stuff to go back to to kick the Palestinians out. They will literally pay for you. If you prove you're Jewish or from Bani Israel, they will pay you to go back. So these are Christians. They historically persecuted them. But no, Allah, these people came to their assistance. وَبَنِينَ. Again, not just your sons. Banin means son. Even the world's superpower, 300 million Americans at your service. Yeah, the British at your service, the French at your service, the Soviet Union were the first to recognize Israel at your service. Sons, people willing to fight for you, even though they were not from Bani Israel. So Allah, this is just say, وَأَمْدَدْنَاكُمْ, we assisted you with wealth and with sons, both from yourself and from other people's sons. Yani other people were willing to sacrifice their lives for your sake. Do you understand? Yeah? And even in Egypt now, we have Sisi, president, who's willing to sacrifice the Egyptian people for Bani Israel. Yani he's willing to sacrifice, how many Egyptians are there? 100 million for Bani Israel. So, do you understand? And he said this, the Egyptian army is to protect the borders with Israel. Yani the large Egyptian army is there too at the service of Bani Israel. So that's all part of it. وَأَمْدَدْنَاكُمْ بِأَمْوَالٍ وَبَنِينَ. Yeah? وَبَنِينَ. Yeah? وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أَكْثَرَ نَفِيرًا. In all of the wars with between the Arabs and Israelites, and before 1948, after 1948 and so on, the Bani Israel always were more ready, more prepared, and even outnumbered them. In 1948, all of the Arabs allegedly mobilized, led by a British general. Think about how ridiculous that is. The British gave them Israel, and then another British general is fighting himself by mobilizing and leading the Arab armies. لأن أصلا, by the way, when Britain occupied and took Palestine from the Ottomans, they did it with the donkey Egyptian soldiers, yani the so-called the greatest army in the world, Egypt, blah, blah, blah. These donkeys were the ones. Can you guys still hear me? Yeah? Yeah? In 1948, just to show you what it means that they were more prepared by mobilization. In 1948, even though they were outnumbered in terms of population, the actual Arabs who were cowardly enough to join the front line were less in number than the Israelis, than the Jewish Haganah gangs. Meaning the Jews were able to muster more people than the combined Arab world Yeah, in 1967, they were extremely ill-prepared. Because Gamal Abdel Nasser and Hafez al-Assad, they were busy persecuting the people, killing the people. Their army was used to control the people and so on and so on. They were busy killing Quranic reciters like Sayyid Qutb and so on. And the Israeli army at the front line, the rabbis were reading the Torah and fighting. So they had a better aqidah. I don't mean their aqidah is correct and where it's not, but in terms of they were more ideologically motivated at that time. Yeah, so and they won. And even in 1973, they were taken aback, but they quickly sprung back. In 1973, which the Egyptians and Syrians falsely claimed was a victory, they were taken aback. Then the Israelis quickly mobilized, and they reached 20 kilometers of Syria, and they reached 100 kilometers of Cairo. In other words, they had this mobilization. Even now, they're constantly updating their military defenses. While what are the Egyptian army doing? Food. They literally have a general for prawns. Prawns, the food. They have a general for the prawn manufacture, general for tomatoes, general for cucumbers. This is the Egyptian army. I'm not even lying. And then the Syrians, we all know the Syrians, the Syrian army, the Lebanese Beirut Knights, nothing. Hezbollah outperforms the entire Lebanese army, and Hezbollah itself busy growing Sisa and killing Syrians. The point is,
Are they more strong than the more better equipped than their enemy? We saw this, yeah. Now, if you say to me this is something that happened in the past, when did the Bani Israel became more equipped than the Babylonians? Were more better mobilized than the Babylonians and the Assyrians? The people say this applies. The second facade is the Romans. Give me one incident where Bani Israel were able to overcome the Romans. No, it only happened now. This is clearly a prophecy that has happened after Islam. Now, to emphasize this, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ. The second promise, Allah describes it as the final promise. The wa'd al-akhirah. It's a very interesting choice of words. This phrase, wa'd al-akhirah, only occurs twice in the Quran, both in Surah Isra. We'll talk about the second. The second time is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. This is near the end of the Surah, Surah Isra. When the final promise comes, when the final, as in the second promise comes, جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. We gathered you into one place. The word lafifa, there's no point in giving me the translation. It'll probably be translated wrong. Yeah. So, by the way, again, a lot of the English translations are just taking what Ibn Kathir and somebody says, and it's all we know. The most of are completely wrong. Came to understanding these verses based on the fact that reality has actually happened, contrary to what they say. فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. When the final, so the Quran mentions وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ twice. Now, the scholars of tafsir randomly said the first wa'd al-akhirah is referring to the second promise, which they thought was the Romans, or they had different opinions of what they thought it was. And then the second wa'd al-akhirah, they randomly said it's the final day of judgment. That there's no rationality behind that. There's no. They just said that because again, they never thought that Bani Israel. They never thought that. It never occurred to them, but it happened. So what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says is, when the final promise comes, when the second promise comes, which the Jewish people are celebrating and the Christian Zionists are celebrating as something that started in 1948, when that second promise comes, we will gather you. We will gather you. جِئْنَا بِكُمْ لَفِيفًا. We will gather you throughout into one place. Lafifa means, you know, when you make a sandwich and you put different components like cucumbers, tomatoes, hummus, it's like a mosaic of things. We will gather you into one fabric, or to wrap you. It's like wrapping you, but the individual components are different. Because this is what happened. They were Russians, they were Americans, they were British, they were from India, from China, from Africa. They were all gathered into one place. Yeah, and they were all gathered into one place. Now there are some people who say, but these people that were gathered into one place, they are not the original tribes of Bani Israel. Now, there are ways you can answer them on this. The first one is that if you imitate a people, you are from them. This is a well-known Islamic concept. If you imitate a people, you are from them. Secondly, Allah was able, through divine decree, to be able to gather them, extract them from their different backgrounds and cultures back into the one place. Yani, even though they've now thousands of years has gone by since the first facade, they now speak with American accents, with British, they've intermarried, but they were able to be extracted back. Thirdly, even if they are not, all of them are from the tribes of Israel. We know some of them definitely are. There's a good chance, especially those who were Eastern, from the region, from the Arab world. Many of them were definitely from, and they make a significant component of the Israeli society. We know they definitely go back to Bani Israel. But let's just say the European Ashkenazis, even if you don't think, well, they first of all identify with that. In Islam, it's what you identify with. If I identify as a Christian and start acting like, when khalas, I am considered in judgment and in punishment a Christian. Do you see? If they adopt the behaviors of Bani Israel, they are from Bani Israel. Secondly, they set up a state, a country called Israel. They could have said Yehuda, they could have said Judah, they could have said whatever. They called it Israel, and the Quran is very precise. Bani Israel, they are the children of Israel. They literally are. Yeah? Even if they weren't from the 12 tribes, they now are literally the sons of this nation called Israel. So it's another indicator that their state will be called Israel, nothing else, not Judah, not Yehovah, nothing. They could have had so many names, by the way. They chose Israel. Right. This is a small point, but it's because some people are very annoying. They're like, oh, they're not really Israel. Mate, calm down. They are. Yeah, they have chosen this for themselves. Khalas, they are, and this is their hukm and so on. طيب here وعد الآخرة we said is the second promise, and we told you that this is an indication that there will be no other Israel. Yani they will try afterwards, but there will be. Oh, is it okay now? Can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay. Sorry about the sound quality. So the second promise is the final promise. It means there will be no other promise to this promise. This is it. Khalas. They will try. Doesn't mean they won't do fasad. They will. In fact, the Quran tells us they will do fasad later on. But now, then, like in terms of their political presence, in terms of them having sovereignty in a country, only two times: the kingdom of Israel, and now nothing else. No third time. During the Dajjal, they're going to come but not have a state. They're not going to have a country, an independent, sovereign country. By the way, when they get defeated, they will go back and say, we should have waited for the Messiah. And they will wait. And when Dajjal comes, they'll run to him. Run to him because they think he is the Messiah. Right. These are big people who said they were gathered into one land, and this is what happened in 1948. And this is also mentioned in their books. Also, you have to understand that their prophecy is that we will come back after the destruction of the kingdom, and the first kingdom of Israel, and we will come back and set up a second Israel. So all of them, even if you speak to Jewish people, they say, the rabbis and so on, they say to you, the state of Israel in 1948 is the prophecy of the second time. And yet we insist that we should follow or incorrect opinions that it was the previous, both of the fasad were pre-Islamic. The fact that they were able to set up the state of Israel shows that the prophecy is correct. It nullifies. Okay. طيب. فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says إن أحسنتم لأنفسكم وإن أسأتم فلها. If you do good for your own good. If you're just for your own good. If you're kind, you're kind for your own good. Don't pretend you're doing this for the sake of Allah. You're doing a favor to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're good for yourself. وإن أسأتم فلها. And if you're bad, it's going to come back on you. It's going to come back to bite you. This is like a reminder from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it's actually a threat. This is a threat from Allah. It's like a veiled threat. When you have a veiled threat. Basically, you better be good or else you're going to be punished. You better be just or else you're punished. Come on, even though they're kuffar, pagans, and so on, but they still have to be just. And they were not just. They first of all kicked the Palestinians out. They subjugated the Palestinians. They sought political power, even though they were told to wait until the Messiah. There were many reasons. They didn't even believe in the true Messiah, Isa ibn Maryam, who came to them. For many reasons, they committed fasad, and therefore they had to be punished. So this is a veiled threat. When the second and final promise comes, فَإِذَا جَاءَ وَعْدُ الْآخِرَةِ, look at this. Look at فَإِذَا. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says فَإِذَا means it hasn't happened yet during the time of Isra. فَإِذَا, when it eventually comes. But to make it even clearer, لِيَسُوءُ وُجُوهَكُمْ. لِيَسُوءُ وُجُوهَكُمْ. There's something missing here. The missing here is that we will send servants from us who will darken your face. لِيَسُوءُ has several meanings. One of them, it means no. It doesn't say Allah will have mercy on them. It says in أحسنتم أحسنتم لأنفسكم وإن أسأتم فلها. Where is mercy? There's no mercy here. Please. فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة ليسوء وجوهكم. When the second promise comes, when you start your 1948 project and state and so on, then ليسوء وجوهكم. We're not there yet. This is the next stage. فإذا جاء وعد الآخرة ليسوء وجوهكم. طيب. The word ليسوء, and there are Quranic variants that say لنسوء وجوهكم. We, referring back to Allah, will darken your face. And the other one is ليسوء لنسوء. So there's different ways. One attributing it that their faces will be darkened, i.e. Bani Israel. The one is Allah will darken their face, and the other one is their enemies. Their enemies, the Muslims, will darken their face. They both say the same thing. It's just from different perspectives, if you think about it. What does the word yasu mean? Yasu. It has two meanings. One of them is like in a war, when you cause a catastrophic defeat to your enemy, their faces will scowl, will frown, will be darkened, will be like shamed, as in they will be so humiliated in war. Instead of Allah talking about the war and the casualties, He just mentions their psychological state, their facial expression. So if their facial expression was like this, what, let alone the rest of the war? Do you see? It's like an indication of something more severe. The other one is that لِيَسْتُوءَ وُجُوهُكُمْ إِسَاءَةُ الْوَجْهِ. When you say إِسَاءَةُ الْوَجْهِ, أَسَأْتُ وَجْهَكَ, means I made you look bad in front of the people. Yes, so it can have two meanings. One could be, and the meaning in war is actually unconventional, because you don't usually say, and they destroyed you, they wiped you out, they took, but to talk about the facial frowning in war is a little bit unusual. So there is another meaning, which is that they will make you look bad, meaning they will win the media narrative. They will they will make you look bad in front of the nation. They will expose your facade in front of the nations. And when that happens, then وَلْيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِدِ, then they will enter the masjid. Now, some people said al-masjid here is the temple. No, al-masjid here is Masjid al-Aqsa, because the Quran mentions that it says Masjid al-Aqsa at the beginning of the verse. I don't want to go into a lengthy discussion about the temple and Masjid al-Aqsa. They're not the same. We have bought into this fake narrative that they're the same. The temple is a separate structure that Sulaiman built that was very tiny, by the way. It was like a room, and they would tie the rabbi as he goes in. So in case he died, because they're not allowed to enter it, only the most sacred and knowledgeable could enter it. And they would pull them out. And this was a tiny room that had the relics and religious items. But it wasn't a place of, it was more of an administrative building, and it was a separate structure. It was a separate structure. Masjid al-Aqsa is a separate thing that Sulaiman helped restore or develop or build upon. So, like, don't confuse both things. But in any case, the Quran here is mentioning it as a masjid, not as a temple, because it's going to go back to the Muslim. And it says, وَلْيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِدِ, they will enter the masjid. Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the masjid. Even the Romans destroyed. Here, لِيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِدِ, they will enter the masjid. Meaning, they're coming in their aim is the masjid. Their aim is to liberate the masjid. Do you see? It's referring to Muslims. كَمَا دَخَلُوهُ أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ, as they entered it the first time. What do they mean by the first? Again, none of this applies to Nebuchadnezzar, to the Romans, the Greek. This doesn't apply to anyone in history. Who tried to enter the masjid first time, second time? It's the Muslims. The first time, Umar ibn al-Khattab. Then the second time is Salah ad-Din. And the third time is soon, inshallah. Soon, coming soon, yeah? Preview. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is indicating that we will enter the masjid in the future, not like Salah ad-Din entered it. We're not going to imitate Salah ad-Din's way of entering it. We're going to enter it like Umar ibn al-Khattab. Now, this could mean several things. It could mean the characteristic of the leader who will enter it will be more like Umar ibn al-Khattab than Salah ad-Din. For example, more harsh, where Salah ad-Din was known for his tolerance. He forgave a lot of the crusaders and so on. Or it could mean that we will enter it in a state of khilafah, for example, because Salah ad-Din was not a khalifa, but Umar ibn Khattab was a khalifa. Or it could mean something else. It could mean the ethnicity as well, that the Arabs, not the Kurd. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, it could mean so many things. This needs to be exposed. What is the difference between how Umar ibn al-Khattab entered it and how Salah ad-Din entered it? It could be that the Bani Israel will give up, like the Umar ibn Khattab entered it quite easily, like effortlessly almost. Yeah. Whereas, and it was based on a prophecy. Notice, Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he entered Bayt al-Maqdis, it was based on a Christian biblical prophecy about the donkey, the rider of the donkey, referring to Umar ibn al-Khattab, and they let him when they saw him. Likewise, the leader who will enter in the future will enter it based upon this prophecy. That could be another similarity as well. So again, do you see? كَمَا دَخَلُوهُ أَوَّلَ مَرَّةٍ, and they're entering it, they're not destroying it, they're not vandalizing it. وَلِيُتَبِّرُوا مَا عَلَوْا تَتْبِيرًا, and they will destroy the symbols of transgression completely. What are these symbols of transgression? The wall that divides the Palestinians and Israelis, the settlement, the Knesset, the Mish'arfe. These things will be destroyed. In other words, they will destroy your rotten state. Yeah? And it goes back to their rise, transgression. Yeah? This is the end of the prophecy. But the next bit is عَسَى رَبُّكُمْ أَنْ يَرْحَمَكُمْ وَإِنْ عُدْتُمْ عُدْنَا, meaning in your defeat, maybe this will be a chance for you to repent to Allah, to accept Islam, to understand you were wrong. You thought the state will never end. You thought it will be. Maybe it's time to accept عسى ربكم أن يرحمكم. But then, so he's giving them a chance to do tawbah. And by the way, don't assume that Bani Israel, when they've defeated, they're just going to be like that. Maybe many of them will accept Islam. They'll realize what they were told is a bunch of lies, and they accept Islam. No. Just like a lot of crusaders, some of them became Muslims, by the way. Not all of them went back to Europe. Some of them accepted Islam. Yeah. He said, Allah, even though you will not state in the future, but if you ever try to form transgressions, we will send people against you. We will send people to crush you. Even as groups. If you try to re-establish another Israel, we'll just crush you this time. If you try to come back, it doesn't mean we'll let you succeed. This time it's gonna be a direct response. Yeah? And that's what's gonna happen. When the Dajjal comes, he will be followed by 70,000 Yahud from Asfahan. These Jews will say, oh, we were wrong to set up the state of Israel in a secular Zionist paradigm. We should have waited for you, oh Messiah. Let's go. But they will not be able to succeed. And maybe there will be other times. Between now and the Dajjal is a long, long time. The other thing is, we want to clarify something quickly before I end. The Mahdi has nothing to do, and the black banners, which is a weak hadith, has nothing to do with the liberation of Palestine that is coming up. Nothing to do with it at all. Nothing. Yeah, this is a separate prophecy told to the Bani Israel that is now happening, and we're in the midst of it. Nothing to do with Mahdi. Mahdi is going to come around the time of the Dajjal. And yes, Bani Israel will still be relevant, as in we told you, they will try to mobilize again, but this is nothing. The battle at the end of time with them is a separate matter. There is no evidence whatsoever and no indication that Mahdi is going to start the liberation. This is liberation involving something else, the different group of Muslims that have nothing to do with the Mahdi. So that's the other important point to mention. And secondly, the whole point of a lot of people say like, oh, the Afghanis are going to do it. The black banners hadith are fake. Like, I don't know if even a single one of them is sahih. A lot of people, they go with weak hadith and they build entire, like Sufyani. Every hadith about Sufyani is da'if. Every hadith. It's a fake. There's no Sufyani. It's a fake character. It doesn't exist. And yet people have, oh, is Bashar Sufyani? Is Saddam Sufyani? It's all fake. It's not real. It's not real. Mahdi is real. Mahdi will come, but Mahdi has nothing to do with Palestine. His Khilafah will be in Palestine. This is a different matter. But he will not be part of the liberation that's coming up. Nothing to do with him whatsoever. I yield the mic if anyone has any questions. Sorry for going on for a long time. There were many other issues about the numerology, but look, the problem with telling you about the numerology, about when we think this date will happen, I would have to first show you that there is numerical structure in the Quran. Then I would have to show you that there are previous dates in the past, like the death of Sayyidina Sulaiman and so on, are mentioned in the Quran. Then I would have to try to convince you that there is a future date for the destruction of Israel. And they're not linked. Just because there's numerical structure in the Quran doesn't mean that the previous dates. Just because there's previous dates in the Quran does not mean that the future date is correct. So it's a lot of speculation. And I wanted today to not be about that much speculation. The final thing about Surah Al-Hashr, I told you, هو الذي أخرج الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب من ديارهم لأول الحشر. If you look at what the Prophet ﷺ, the athar about this, when they were kicked out of Arabia, they went to Bilad al-Sham for the first gathering, meaning the beginning of the gathering. In other words, the Quran is indicating that their gathering started. They couldn't go anywhere in the world. They chose to go Bilad al-Sham. They were mobilizing, and then they kept on doing this until 1948. So the Quran is saying in Surah Al-Hajj, their expulsion triggered the beginning of this prophecy, and it happened. Anyway, أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم والسلام عليكم. I'll hang around for any questions. طيب. Is this the first? Was there any scholars who predicted Israel? What do you mean predicted? As in before 1948? No, in the past, no one imagined that Israel will ever have a political union until the Dajjal comes. They thought they will never be powerful until the Dajjal comes. They thought it's just something that will just miraculously happen, because they were persecuted everywhere in the world. As in, they were just ghettos and stuff. So never, until up to like the mobilization in Palestine actively, when they really gathered الحشر proper بقى, not أول الحشر, but the end of the Hajj, then people never even crossed their mind, especially they came out of the Holocaust. So it just never occurred. And I would be the same. If I was there, I would never assume, for example, the Rohingya are going to be a superpower. Abu Tayyib, when Allah says, we send against you servants of ours, does that mean even servants as in creation and not previous? Yeah, as in Ibadah, it's just kuffar or Muslims. It's just any servants, as in just people he created, human beings. No. As they entered it, who entered? Okay. Did the Babylonians, after they destroyed the first temple, did Bani Israel overcome them and then they re-entered it? This has never happened. Did that happen to the Ashurians? Did that happen to the Romans? None of this happened. Like, as in, it never happened that they entered it. And secondly, why would they enter again the first temple? It doesn't even make sense. They destroyed the temple. Then what did they enter? It's destroyed. Khalas. The first temple is destroyed. Why would the Babylonians come back, which they didn't? Historically, they didn't. To come back to re-enter a masjid. And why is that even significant for them as a masjid? And it didn't exist. They had destroyed it already. So it doesn't make sense what you're saying. Will Israel build their temple? No, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِد. They will enter the masjid. So Masjid al-Aqsa will remain intact until the Muslims liberate it again. Zionism is a political ideology, secular political ideology, and atheists can be Zionists. Muslims, there are some alleged Muslims who claim to be Muslims who are Zionists. Like, there's even a scholar, not a scholar, a student of, but let's say Sheikh Wasim Yusuf, he claims to be a scholar of tafsir, and he's a Zionist. Bin Zayed, Sisi are Zionists. So you can be Arabs and Zionists, you can be American. There's a lot of American Christian Zionists and so on. So Zionism just means that you believe in the political ideology of Jews returning to facilitate the end of time prophecies. But it also has a secular meaning that they believe that Jews have a right to return to the homeland. But a lot of people accepted Zionism for religious reasons, especially from the other faiths. Wait, any other questions? The temple will not be destroyed, will be built. A Masjid al-Aqsa will be there when the liberation happens, according to the Quran. Like, is there any other question before we leave? Is the hadith about the Muslims fighting the Jews in the... Yes, so I said to you, the Muslims fighting Bani Israel at the end of time is going to the Yahud is going to be correct. It's an authentic narration. That this is when they will follow the Dajjal as their promised Messiah in order to try to restore the Israel that was destroyed earlier. Do you see? When Israel was destroyed, I think a lot of them will say we made a mistake that we should have waited for the Messiah. So they will wait for the Messiah. Why are they waiting in Asfahan? Why will they eventually go back to wait in Asfahan? Like now, there are not 70,000 Jews in Asfahan. Why will they eventually? Because I think they will reinterpret they go back to the scripture, whether it's the Torah, Tanakh, or Talmud, or Kabbalah, or whatever, and they will then realize that the Dajjal, the Mahdi, the so-called false Messiah, is going to be Iranian descent. Is going to be from Persia. So, and already they have a soft spot for Persia because they believe the Babylonians and the Arabs, what we call the modern day Arabs, destroyed them. But the Persian king, there was a Persian leader who took them out and saved them and so on. They do have a soft spot, despite the hatred of Iran. They hate the current system of Iran, but generally the Persian culture, they like it, and they believe that, and it's most likely true, that Dajjal will come from Iran. He will either be from the Jews of Iran or the Shia of Iran or both. Maybe he has some Jewish descent, but he's actually Shia, I don't know. But it's clear that he's going to come from that region. Yes, but look, they want the temple, but I think that their destruction will happen. The state of Israel will be destroyed before they have a chance to build their temple. Do you think that Israel will convert the Aqsa into a temple? No, I do not think so, because the Quran is clear that its liberation will be the masjid. It doesn't say the temple. It doesn't the masjid al-Aqsa. Masjid. They will enter the masjid, so it has to be intact for them to enter it. Look, Bayt al-Maqdis came under Muslim rule, but it never was the center of the Khilafah. The center of the Khilafah will only happen, even by the way, when it's liberated soon, we may, don't assume that it's going to be the center of the Khilafah. But before the hour comes, Bayt al-Maqdis has to be the center of the Khilafah. Do you understand? But before, it has never been the center of the Khilafah. Even though Muslims could have made it the center of the Khilafah, there was a lot of incentive to make it. Even after the liberation from Salah ad-Din, it was never made the center of the Khilafah. But in the future, especially really the end of times, it will be made the center of the Khilafah. It can't be a masjid, no, because the Quran says لِيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِد. So you're saying to me that they destroyed the masjid is destroyed, then they will try to re-enter it. But in the ruins, yani, of it? I mean, possibly they could destroy structures within the masjid. Maybe they will destroy the dome of the rock. But the Masjid al-Aqsa is a plot of land. It's an area, a geographical area in Al-Quds, which includes the dome of the rock, where the dome of the rock is. But they could destroy parts of the structure, but that structure will remain there as a masjid. So yes, there is a possibility they could destroy parts of it. And maybe that's actually what triggers the liberation. They destroy parts of it and it angers them. But the point is, the key essence of the masjid will be there when the Muslims enter. Well, by making it a capital city, Qarani, what's the incentive to make it a capital city? By making it a capital city, they are actually fulfilling the prophecy. Because the prophet says, لِيَدْخُلُوا الْمَسْجِد, they will enter the masjid, which is in Jerusalem. Because when you take over a country, you have to take the capital city. You have to take the capital. If you, for example, in Afghanistan, you can take Kandahar, Jalalabad, Malalabad, but unless you take Kabul, you have not taken the country. So you have to take the country. Yeah. 2022. So okay. When do the Yahud get the third temple prophecy? It's a fake prophecy that's made up. I think they made that up, or maybe when the Dajjal comes, he will try to build them something. I don't know, but they clearly, or he will promise to build them the third temple. But it could be something they made up. By the way, I noticed this. If you read the prophecies about Ya'juj and Ma'juj, which all apply to Muslims, they act as if they're the ones who are going to deal with the Ya'juj and Ma'juj. So a lot of the prophecies are similar, but then they just replace themselves there. They kind of edited the bits out where they're going to be destroyed and just focus on as if history continues with them. So yeah. Like, any other questions? That's a good question. I think he can, but I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if he will. Whether he can, I don't know, but I don't know. But he will be killed in Lud, in the area called Lud. No. So what will be the order of events and when Muslims liberate Al-Aqsa? And no, so the arrival of Mahdi has nothing to do with the upcoming liberation. Let's just say it's next year or 2027 or whatever, 100 years. It's not related to Mahdi whatsoever. Mahdi is going to be triggered by other events called the Malhama, the Grand War that will happen. First of all, when Mahdi comes, there will be an existing Khilafah already. There will be an ongoing Khilafah, and so on and so on. So, and that Khilafah doesn't seem to be in Bayt al-Maqdis. It will be probably somewhere else. So Mahdi coming could be hundreds of years from now. It has nothing to do with this Palestine prophecy. Who will liberate Palestine? So that's a tough one, because obviously you look at now and you think, who could liberate it? So it almost certainly will be people from the neighboring countries or Palestine itself. It's not going to be Afghanis or Pakistanis, or not because they can't do it, but because the prophecy seems to be dealing with a common enemy back and forth with one kind of people, one kind of ethnic people. So the Babylonians were basically what we would call the Syrians, the Iraqis now, parts of Arabia, and so on and so forth. So it seems to be that the liberation will come either from Bilad al-Sham, from Iraq, from maybe Turkey, maybe, because it's part of the near Middle East. But yani, I hope not Iran. Yani, imagine the Shia are the ones who liberated. That'll be a catastrophe. I'd actually prefer the Zion. But anyway, yeah. So there could be, it would most likely be from Bilad al-Sham, somewhere from Bilad al-Sham, who will liberate it, whether it's Syria or whether it's Iraq or whether it's actual Palestine itself. So we don't know. Secondly, we don't know how the war will take. It may be they will just overcome them, and there will be like a war where they'll lose and just surrender. We don't know. Like we always assume it's going to be like Salahuddin, where it could be like more like Umar ibn Khattab, where they will just surrender in large mass and be expelled from the land. So do you see? Like it's not very clear. That's the thing. The word liyasu'u wujuhakum, they will darken your face, or they will make you look bad. They will make you look bad. Suggests that near the liberation, the image of Israel as the victim who's surrounded by all these bullying Arab nations is going to change. They're going to they're going to lose the media narrative, and they're going to lose the support. But also, I want to remind you something. The Soviet Union were defeated when they had nuclear weapons. They had nuclear weapons. They were one of the largest, most powerful nations that have ever existed, and they lost in Afghanistan. So, let's not. Bani Nadir, Bani Nadir, Bani Qaynuqa, they had strong alliances. They were very heavily fortified, and they lost. Let's not. We tend to have this habit of overestimating our enemy's capabilities. Can you explain the 2022? So I want to do a separate talk on the 2022, but very briefly. The question is, if this prophecy existed, let's assume this prophecy is now 100% correct, that I just told you. The question is, can we deduce a date from this prophecy? Now, you would say, no, come on, the Quran doesn't give you future dates. But there is a precedent. Salah ad-Din, 60 or so years before Salah ad-Din liberated Masjid al-Aqsa in the year 1187 AD, when he liberated before he liberated Masjid al-Aqsa, there was a scholar in Andalus. This is before Salah ad-Din was even born. There's no Salah ad-Din in the world. He's still not even a baby. Still before he's born. There was a scholar all the way in Andalus called Ibn Burjan, a hardcore Sufi scholar. That's why I told you in the beginning about Sheikh Yasir Khan, and we can't just cancel people out just because we dislike them. We may disagree with his Sufism, but here he did a good thing. He did tafsir of the Quran, and his tafsir is very profound. He went into the Quranic variants. Again, another irony of starting with Yasir Qadi and then mentioning about a scholar in Andalus who talked about Quranic variants. He went in depth with Quranic variants. If you read his tafsir, which is available now online, it was a manuscript form, it's available. It really is remarkable. In Surah Al-Rum, غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون. The Romans have been defeated, and after their defeat they will be victorious. He found an authentic Quranic variant that has been abrogated, which says the Romans have become victorious, and after their victory will be defeated, then they will be do you know the other way around? Basically, the Romans have become victorious, then they will be defeated. So the other way around. He said, so the Quran, even though it's abrogated, but it was still true. It's still a revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he said, because of this, he said, therefore, the Quran is talking about two parallel historical timelines. One in which the Romans during the time of Prophet Muhammad ﷺ were defeated and they will be victorious. And another parallel timeline, this is only a Sufi could come up with it, to be honest, and another parallel timeline another parallel timeline in which the Romans, where he takes to mean the Crusaders, the Romans will be victorious over the Muslims, then they will be defeated. So he's saying the Quran is talking about two parallel timelines. And then he says, in a few years, he said the word sana likewise has two parallel meanings. He said the conventional meaning, the apparent meaning of sana is it's a couple of years, right? But it's like 12 months. But he said there is another meaning where sana could be 1,000 months, a parallel timeline. So he said there's a parallel incidences. The Quran is talking about two parallel events with two parallel timelines. Then I'm not going to go into the calculations now. We can do that in an exciting talk about numerology, where he then calculates that it will be in Rajab of 1187 in the equivalent year of Hijri. So he writes this, and he says, And now the year is 522, and of course the victory I think came in 586 or something like that. So he's saying in 522 when he wrote this, he says it is now 522, but the liberation will come in Rajab of 587. The evidence that Salah ad-Din and his army knew about this was Muhyiddin, the person who gave the khutbah, the first khutbah after Salah ad-Din was victorious. He after the liberation, he was asked. Before, 3 years before the liberation, when they defeated the traitors in Aleppo. So even though they didn't weren't victorious over the Crusaders in Aleppo, but it was considered a victory over the Crusaders because these are traitors and collaborators and so on. When he defeated them in Aleppo 3 years before the liberation, he did a song, like a poetry or like a song where he said, "We will be victorious in Rajab." Basically, we're now defeating, but now we're going in the future. We will be victorious in Rajab. When they entered Masjid Haram, Al-Quds in Rajab of 583, how did you know you will enter it in this exact month? And obviously he knew the exact year. He said, because I had read it in the tafsir of Ibn Burjan. Yeah. So do you see? So this was a clear prophecy, derived date, in using a very unconventional form of tafsir. A very unconventional form of tafsir. Yet he was able to derive this date. None of the scholars who follow that the Quran doesn't have dates and numerology can explain this. They cannot explain this. There is no rational explanation for this. So I spoke to people, scholars and so on, who are vehemently against the idea of the Quran having dates and stuff, cannot explain this. They just say, "Oh, we don't know. It's just an aberration of history." And yeah, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy. I get what you're saying, but it's still difficult. Yani, how did the crusade? Okay, fine. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy from the point of Salah ad-Din. But how did the crusade? But you remember, it wasn't up to Salah ad-Din. It was up to the Crusaders when they will surrender and when they will be defeated. How would he know that they will be defeated this time? And how will he control the outcome of the defeat? Only Allah controls the outcome of the defeat. We don't know this. Like even the most powerful army, when they're fighting an enemy, you don't know when you're going to crush them and they're going to surrender. So this is something that. So I agree what you're saying, but this is, by the way, indication that just because you know of prophecy doesn't mean it's going to make you lazy. It can also encourage you to do good action. Like now, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was a wheelchair-bound sheikh, who was the resistance in Hamas, yani, and he was the spiritual father of the resistance, and also, to be honest, the spiritual father of all the Palestinians. He was wheelchair-bound, and obviously a couple of years ago, like around 10 years ago, so he was killed while he was in his wheelchair. Yani, subhanAllah, he was powerless in terms of physically powerless, but his words frightened the Israelis. His fatwas frightened the Israelis so much that they killed him. And of course, when they killed him, he was in his wheelchair. While he was in his wheelchair, he obviously was liberated from his wheelchair into the hearts of the Greens. It's not the point. The point is not to be sentimental. The point is that he came on Al Jazeera live television, and he said, and this is something he's been saying even before. He said his deduction is Israel will be destroyed in 2027. Why? How did he come up with that? He said he looks at the verses, not in Surah Isra, somewhere else, where he was talking about that Bani Israel were only allowed to enter after a generation. They were only allowed to enter the first after a generation because they refused to fight. Bani Israel refused to fight because of their cowardice. They said they told Musa, "You go, you go and fight with your Lord. We will never fight." So they were punished by waiting for 40 years before they could enter. But here, Sheikh Yassin said, "Oh, we Palestinians are in the same boat. We refuse to fight, and we will only be allowed to enter it after 40 years of starting to fight." So he deduced it based on that parallel by assuming that we are Bani Israel. So it's a very crude way of doing it. But he said we started the Intifada in 1986, I think, and so therefore we will be. It will be 2027 because you add 40 years to 2027. But reality is you could have been 1982 as well because when Israel invaded Lebanon, the Palestinians were fighting Israel from 1982. So the fight actually started in 1982, not 1987. Did you guys hear me? So I don't know how much you heard of that. So Ahmed Yassin is saying the fight, the Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Allah yarhamu, is, oh, you heard it. خلاص ماشي. طيب. but this is a very crude way, and so it depends where you would start the calculation. It could be 1982, and then you would end up with 2022. It could be 1986. It could be the second Intifada. And you could also say no. The first Intifada was secular. The second Intifada is religious. So we start with this second Intifada in 2000. Then the date will be even later. So the point here is Sheikh Ahmad Nassim may be correct about the 40 years, but assuming the generation is exactly 40 years, but it's a bit like crude as to when you would start and end. Then there's another scholar, but he's the most senior Palestinian scholar in the history of the conflict, and yet he believes the numerical patterns in the Quran that would lead us to the exact date or the year of Bani Israel. Then there's another Palestinian scholar in the West Bank called Sheikh Bassam Jarrar, who actually studied under Sheikh Bouti in Damascus, but he disagrees with him politically. He said, his opinion is different. He went in a very detailed systematic calculation, more closer to Ibn Burjan's esoteric way of doing it, by looking at counting the words, letters, numerical. It's too long to talk now because Maghrib time is coming. I can't talk about it now and read the whole topic. But he then writes a book in 1992 in the concentration camp. He was expelled for a while in Lebanon, in the concentration camp, and while he's in the concentration camp, he writes a book where he does the calculations from Surah Isra and deduces. First, he establishes that there is numerical patterns in the Quran by reviewing Rashad Khalifa's false calculations about the 19. He shows that the 19 has some basis, but Rashad Khalifa lied about some of the calculations and was deceiving, and then he claimed prophethood incorrectly, as a myth. But he shows that there is some basis of numerical patterns. Then he shows that dates in the Quran, like the fall of the kingdom of Saba, like the Sayyidina Sulaiman's rise and fall, the people of the Ahl Kitab. Then he does the calculations for Surah Isra, and in Hijri, in Miladi, and in the Hebrew year, shows that they all coincide with the same thing. So he says it's 2022. But even if it's true, which is speculation, we don't know if it's true, this could be the start of the liberation. So he thinks it's going to be, I think March, the end of March, or I can't remember the exact month and date, but he thinks it's going to be March of 2022. And he then says, okay, I can show you that 1948 is in the Quran. I can show you that Salah ad-Din and Umar ibn Khattab's liberation in the Quran. I can show you. So he said, therefore, again, it's speculation. We can go into it in a separate topic, but we have to go for Maghrib. Allahumma salli wa sallim wa barik ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I ask Allah by your grand name, باسمك الأعظم لا إله إلا أنت يا حي يا قيوم أن تنصر المسجد الأقصى أن ترزقنا صلاة في المسجد الأقصى. May Allah by his grand name لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم to grant us a prayer in Masjid al-Aqsa when it's liberated, and to relieve the people of the Uyghurs against the tyrannical Chinese communists. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. جزاك الله خير أخي.
I'm afraid I must go for the prayer. So,